This is Secrets of the Silk Road Strangler, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to the Little Grey Cells. I'm Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey. If you're joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a mystery. Tonight, we travel to the crossroads of civilizations, where ancient trade routes carried not only silk and spices, but also secrets and death. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Oriental Club. The telegram arrived at Hercule Poirot's comfortable London flat in Whitehaven Mansions on a fog-shrouded December morning, delivered by a messenger boy who seemed eager to escape the bitter cold that had gripped the city for days. The message contained within the small yellow envelope was brief but electrifying in its implications, sending Poirot's grey cells into immediate activity. Urgent, stop. Third victim found, stop. Silk cord around neck, stop. Same pattern as Constantinople and Cairo, stop. Require your immediate assistance, stop. Colonel Donahue, Oriental Club, London. Poirot read the message twice, then a third time, his magnificent moustache twitching slightly as his grey cells began to process the information contained within those terse, urgent words. 3 victims, 3 cities spanning 2 continents. A signature method of execution, strangulation with a silk cord. This was no ordinary murder. This was the work of a killer who moved across international borders with impunity, who struck and vanished like a phantom in the night, who left behind only a whisper of silk as testament to their deadly and methodical craft. He had heard whispers of such a killer during his time consulting with Scotland Yard. Vague rumours that had drifted through the intelligence services like smoke from a distant fire, never quite substantial enough to grasp firmly. The Silk Road Strangler, some had called him in hushed tones. Others spoke of the ghost of the caravans, a spectral figure who seemed to materialize from the desert sands to claim his victims. But until now, the murders had seemed too distant, too exotic, too removed from the orderly streets of London to warrant the sustained attention of a Belgian detective working in England. That had changed with the arrival of this telegram. The killer had come to England, had struck in the very heart of London itself. And now the threat was no longer distant or abstract, but immediate and terrifying. The Oriental Club occupied a distinguished Georgian townhouse in Hanover Square, its elegant facade speaking of colonial wealth and Eastern adventure accumulated over generations. Founded in the previous century by gentlemen who had served with distinction in India and the Far East, it remained a bastion of those who had made their fortunes and their reputations in the mysterious lands beyond Europe's borders, where the British Empire had planted its flag. Poirot presented his engraved card to the porter at the entrance and was escorted through wood-panelled corridors hung with hunting trophies and Eastern artifacts of considerable value and historical significance. Tiger skins from Bengal, elephant tusks from Ceylon, jeweled daggers from Persia, silk tapestries from the looms of China that seemed to shimmer with ancient secrets and whispered promises of mysteries yet unsolved. The air carried the faint but distinctive scent of incense and expensive tobacco, and somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour with solemn dignity. Colonel Archibald Donahue received him in a private study on the first floor of the distinguished establishment, a room dominated by a massive mahogany desk and walls lined with books on Oriental history, culture, religion, and military strategy. The colonel was a man in his late 60s, weathered by decades spent in harsh climates where the British Empire had fought to maintain its grip on distant territories. With piercing blue eyes that had seen much and forgotten little of what they had witnessed. "Monsieur Poirot." He rose from behind his desk to shake hands, his grip firm and military despite his years and the obvious strain of recent events. "Thank you for coming so promptly in response to my urgent summons. I fear we are dealing with something quite beyond the ordinary capabilities of the Metropolitan Police. Something that requires a mind of exceptional analytical power." "The telegram you sent mentioned 3 victims, Colonel. Perhaps you would be so kind as to provide me with the complete details of each case, including any connections between the victims that might explain why they were targeted." Donahue gestured to a comfortable leather armchair positioned before the fire and waited until Poirot was properly seated before continuing with his account. "The first victim was found in Constantinople 6 months ago, during the heat of summer. A British merchant named Harold Pemberton, discovered in his hotel room at the Pera Palace with a silk cord wrapped around his neck. The Turkish authorities investigated the matter thoroughly, but their efforts led nowhere, despite considerable resources being devoted to the case. It was eventually closed as unsolved, one more mystery in a city full of them. And the second victim, who met this same terrible fate? 3 months ago, in the ancient city of Cairo, another British subject, this time a woman of considerable social standing. Lady Marguerite Ashford, the wealthy widow of Sir Charles Ashford, the distinguished diplomat, found strangled in her luxurious suite at the famous Shepherd's Hotel. Again, a silk cord was the instrument of death. Again, there were no witnesses, no suspects, no explanation that satisfied the investigators who examined the case. The victims were connected in some fashion beyond mere coincidence. That is precisely what we have been desperately trying to determine since these terrible events began. Donahue's weathered face darkened with the weight of terrible knowledge. Both Pemberton and Lady Ashford were members of this very club where we now sit. Both had extensive experience in the East. Pemberton as a trader and dealer in antiquities of considerable value. Lady Ashford as a collector and connoisseur of Oriental art who had amassed one of the finest private collections in England. And both, it has become disturbingly clear, were involved in something that someone wanted to keep secret at any cost, even murder. And the third victim? The one whose death brought you to send that urgent telegram to my residence this very morning. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, Knight of the Realm and distinguished veteran of service to the Crown, discovered early this morning in the study of his townhouse, just 2 streets from this very building where we now converse. Same method of execution, silk cord, expertly and professionally applied, with what must have been considerable strength, leaving the victim absolutely no chance to resist or call for help. Donahue's voice caught slightly with the weight of personal grief. Geoffrey was my dear friend, Monsieur Poirot. We served together in Afghanistan 30 years ago during some of the most dangerous campaigns of that era. He was a good man, a brave man, a man of honor and principle. He did not deserve to die like this, murdered in his own home by some phantom killer. No one deserves to die at the hands of a murderer, Colonel Donahue, no matter what their circumstances or past actions. But tell me, what was the specific connection that linked Sir Geoffrey to the other victims who preceded him in death? Beyond their shared membership in this exclusive club, there must be something more substantial that would explain why all three were targeted by the same killer. That is precisely the question I hope you will be able to answer with your famous investigative abilities. Donahue reached into the polished drawer of his massive desk and produced a slim leather folder worn with age and handling. 3 months ago, Geoffrey came to me with a most disturbing story that he had kept hidden for many years. He had received a letter, anonymous, threatening in its language, warning him in the most dire terms to keep silent about something he had witnessed during his time traveling the ancient routes of the Silk Road. He showed me this threatening letter, but he stubbornly refused to explain what secret he was being warned to conceal, even from his oldest and most trusted friend. You have this letter? It was found among his papers this morning, after his body was discovered. Donahue handed over the folder. The police have already examined it, but they found nothing useful. Perhaps your grey cells will prove more perceptive. Poirot opened the folder and studied the letter within. It was typed on plain paper, with no identifying marks or watermarks. The message was brief. The sins of the Silk Road cannot remain buried forever. What was taken must be returned, or the cord will find your neck as it found the others. You have been warned. This was received 3 months ago, you say? Around the time of Lady Ashford's murder in Cairo? Within days of it, yes. I urged Geoffrey to go to the police, but he refused. He said the matter was too delicate, too dangerous to involve the authorities. He said he would handle it himself. And now he is dead. Poirot returned the letter to its folder. Colonel, I must ask you a direct question, and I require a truthful answer. What was the secret? What did Sir Geoffrey witness on the Silk Road that someone was willing to kill to conceal? Donahue was silent for a long moment, his weathered face revealing an internal struggle. Finally, he spoke. 30 years ago, Geoffrey and I were part of an expedition, an archaeological expedition officially, though its true purpose was rather different. We were searching for something that had been lost for centuries, something of immense value. What were you searching for? The Treasure of Tamerlane. The name hung in the air between them, weighted with centuries of history, legend, and the dreams of empire. Tamerlane, the great Mongol conqueror who had built an empire stretching from the plains of India to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, whose fearsome armies had pillaged the accumulated wealth of a dozen ancient civilizations, whose magnificent tomb in the fabled city of Samarkand was said to contain treasures beyond the imagining of ordinary men and women. The treasure is actually real, then, not merely legend? Poirot inquired, with genuine scholarly interest. A portion of it exists in physical form, yes, not merely in the imaginations of dreamers and fortune seekers. According to documents we discovered in a long-forgotten archive in the Afghan capital of Kabul, the great conqueror Tamerlane himself ordered a substantial portion of his personal treasury to be hidden at strategic locations along the Silk Road, to be used in case of emergency or retreat during his ambitious military campaigns across half the known world. The treasure was never recovered after his death. The secret of its precise location died with the loyal servants who buried it under his direct orders. Until your expedition found it and claimed it for yourselves. We found clues, references, a trail of breadcrumbs scattered across centuries that led us on a journey across the vast reaches of Persia and into the treacherous mountains of the Hindu Kush. And there, In a cave that had been sealed and forgotten for 500 years, hidden from the eyes of man, we found something extraordinary. What precisely did you find in that cave, Colonel? Donohue's weathered eyes grew distant, as though he was looking across the decades to that moment of discovery that had changed everything for all of them. Gold. Precious jewels of every description. Artifacts of incalculable historical and artistic value that had been crafted by the finest artisans of the medieval world. Enough treasure to make every single member of our expedition wealthy beyond their wildest dreams of avarice. How many individuals comprised this expedition that made such a remarkable discovery? 7 of us in total set out on that fateful journey. Geoffrey and myself represented the military and organizational expertise. Harold Pemberton, who financed much of the expensive venture from his considerable personal fortune. Lady Ashford, whose late husband, Sir Charles, had been instrumental in obtaining the original documents from sources that remain confidential to this day. And 3 others, Dr. Marcus Webb, a brilliant archaeologist from Cambridge University, Captain James Morrison, our military escort and security specialist, and a local guide named Rashid Khan, who knew the mountains and the ancient pathways better than any Western explorer could hope to learn. 3 of the original 7 expedition members are now dead, murdered by the same skilled hand using the same distinctive method. Yes, that is the terrible arithmetic of our situation. Donohue's voice was heavy with the weight of accumulated guilt and grief. And I cannot help but wonder with increasing dread if the rest of us are marked for the same fate. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood's elegant townhouse was a handsome Georgian structure built in the classical style, its stately facade identical to a dozen others on the quiet and respectable Mayfair Street, where the wealthy and distinguished made their London homes. But as Poirot approached on foot through the chill December air, he noted the police constable stationed conspicuously at the door, the curious neighbours peering from behind their lace curtains at the unusual commotion, and the general atmosphere of barely suppressed excitement and morbid curiosity that always accompanied violent death when it visited the most respectable of neighbourhoods. Inspector James Hartley, of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Division, met him at the entrance with a formal greeting, his manner displaying a mixture of professional courtesy toward a fellow investigator and barely concealed skepticism about the value of consulting detectives. Hartley was a capable and experienced officer. Poirot had worked with him on several previous cases, but he belonged to the school of detectives who trusted physical evidence and dogged legwork over the intuitive leaps of deduction and psychological analysis that characterized Poirot's celebrated methods. Monsieur Poirot, I understand that Colonel Donohue has personally engaged your professional services for this investigation. He has asked for my assistance in determining who is responsible for these terrible crimes. Yes, Inspector. I hope I may be permitted to examine the scene where Sir Geoffrey met his untimely and violent end. The body has been removed to the morgue for medical examination, but the study where the murder took place is otherwise undisturbed. Hartley led him through the entrance hall with its marble floors and up a polished flight of mahogany stairs. I should warn you in advance, there is not much physical evidence to see. The killer appears to have left almost nothing behind that might identify them. Almost nothing is not quite nothing, Inspector Hartley. Even the conspicuous absence of evidence can be informative to the trained observer. The study where Sir Geoffrey had met his end was a comfortable and well-appointed room lined with bookshelves containing volumes accumulated over a lifetime and decorated with souvenirs of Sir Geoffrey's many Eastern adventures. Persian carpets of exceptional quality, Chinese vases from the Ming dynasty, a collection of curved daggers from various Islamic cultures displayed in a glass case of polished mahogany. A large desk dominated the center of the space, and it was behind this desk that Sir Geoffrey had met his violent and untimely end at the hands of the Silk Road Strangler. Poirot moved slowly and methodically through the room, his keen and practiced eyes cataloguing every detail with the thoroughness that had made him famous throughout Europe. The chair behind the desk had been pushed back from its normal position, suggesting that Sir Geoffrey had risen from his seat before being attacked, or perhaps during the attack itself, in a futile attempt to escape or defend himself. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds mentioned in the preliminary report that had been prepared by the attending physician. The victim knew his killer, Poirot observed with quiet certainty, drawing conclusions from the physical evidence before him. He allowed them to approach close enough to strike without raising any suspicion or alarm. That is precisely our conclusion as well, Hartley acknowledged with a nod of professional agreement. The household servants heard nothing unusual during the evening. Sir Geoffrey apparently received a visitor around 9 o'clock last evening, a gentleman caller, according to the butler's testimony, who departed before 10. The body was discovered this morning when Sir Geoffrey failed to appear for his customary breakfast at the usual hour, which aroused the concern of his staff. This evening visitor, has he been identified by your investigation? Not yet, I'm afraid. The butler described him as middle-aged, dark-haired, wearing formal evening dress. He gave his name as Mr. Smith, which is obviously a false identity assumed for the occasion. Obviously indeed, a name chosen for its very ordinariness, designed to be forgotten. Poirot approached the desk and examined its surface with methodical attention to detail. Papers were scattered across the polished wood in apparent disorder. Correspondence, both personal and business. Documents of various kinds. What appeared to be a journal or diary bound in leather. These papers and documents have been examined by your officers? Briefly examined, yes, but nothing immediately relevant to the murder has been discovered. Mostly personal correspondence and business papers, the ordinary detritus of a gentleman's life. Poirot began sorting through the documents with careful, methodical attention to each item. Most were indeed mundane affairs. Letters from friends and acquaintances, bills from various tradesmen and merchants, invitations to social events, and gatherings appropriate to a man of Sir Geoffrey's standing. But one item caught his attention immediately. A small, leather-bound notebook, its pages covered in cramped handwriting that showed signs of age and wear. This notebook. It was found upon the desk among the other papers? Yes. It appears to be some kind of travel journal or expedition record. Dates back 30 years or more, based on the entries we briefly examined. Poirot opened the aged notebook and began to read its contents with growing fascination. The entries described a journey across the vast territories of Persia and Afghanistan. The same expedition Colonel Donahue had mentioned during their interview at the Oriental Club. The writing was detailed and observant, recording not only the physical challenges of the arduous journey, but also the personalities and behaviors of the other expedition members with a novelist's eye for character. One entry, dated several weeks into the expedition, when the group was deep in unfamiliar territory, caught Poirot's particular attention, and caused his grey cells to begin working with renewed intensity. Something is deeply wrong within our party. I have noticed growing tensions among our company that cannot be explained simply by the hardships of travel alone, no matter how challenging those hardships may be. Pemberton and Morrison have been arguing with increasing frequency, though they fall silent whenever I approach. Lady Ashford watches everyone with those cold and calculating eyes of hers, as though she is cataloguing our weaknesses for future exploitation. Even Marcus seems troubled and distracted, though he will not speak of what disturbs him when I attempt conversation. Only Rashid appears unaffected by the atmosphere of suspicion, but then he has seen much in his eventful life and has learned to keep his own counsel. I fear that our remarkable discovery has awakened something dark in our company, something that may prove more dangerous to us all than any bandits or natural hazards we might encounter on the roads ahead. Sir Geoffrey suspected that something was terribly wrong even then, Poirot murmured, as he processed this new information. 30 years ago, in those remote mountains, he sensed the seeds of the tragedy that would eventually claim his own life and the lives of his fellow expedition members. You believe the murders are directly connected to this old expedition? Hartley asked, with evident skepticism about the relevance of such ancient history. I believe that is precisely what we must discover through careful investigation. Poirot continued reading through the aged pages, turning them with growing fascination and mounting concern. The journal described the discovery of the hidden cave, the breaking of the ancient seals, the first breathtaking glimpse of the treasure that had lain hidden and undisturbed for 5 centuries. And then, on the day after that momentous discovery, an entry that made Poirot's grey cells spark with sudden and terrible understanding. Tragedy has struck. Rashid is dead. Found this morning at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken. The others say it was an accident, that he must have lost his footing in the darkness. But I saw the marks on his throat before they covered him with a blanket. Someone strangled him before he fell. Someone in our party is a murderer. Chapter 3. The Survivors. The discovery of the journal entry transformed Poirot's understanding of the case. This was not merely a modern murder mystery, it was the continuation of a crime that had begun 30 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan, when a guide named Rashid Khan had been silenced to protect a secret that someone was still willing to kill for. He returned to the Oriental Club and requested a meeting with Colonel Donahue, but the colonel was not available. Instead, Poirot was directed to the club's library, where he found 2 other individuals who had been summoned in connection with Sir Geoffrey's death. Dr. Marcus Webb was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with a scholar's stoop and eyes that blinked owlishly behind thick spectacles. He had been the expedition's archaeologist, responsible for documenting and preserving whatever artifacts they discovered. Captain James Morrison, by contrast, was a bull of a man, broad-shouldered and ruddy-faced, with the bearing of a soldier who had spent his life in active service. His hair was grey now, but his handshake was still crushing, and his eyes held the sharp assessment of someone who had survived by recognizing threats before they materialized. "Monsieur Poirot," Dr. Webb said as they were introduced, "I have heard of your reputation. I confess I am relieved that someone of your caliber is investigating this dreadful business." "You believe the murders are connected to the expedition?" Poirot asked. "How can they not be? 3 of us dead in 6 months, all killed in the same manner." "Someone is hunting us, Monsieur Poirot. Someone who knows what we found and what happened afterward." What did happen afterward, Dr. Webb? What became of the treasure? Webb and Morrison exchanged glances, a quick, furtive look that told Poirot volumes about the secrets that still bound these men together. The treasure was divided, Morrison said finally. Each member of the expedition received a share. We agreed to keep the discovery secret, partly to avoid legal complications, partly because there were aspects of the expedition that none of us wished to discuss publicly. You refer to the death of Rashid Khan? Both men went pale. Morrison recovered first, his soldier's discipline asserting itself. How do you know about that? Sir Geoffrey kept a journal. He recorded his suspicions at the time, suspicions that Rashid's death was not an accident. Geoffrey always was too observant for his own good, Webb muttered. I told him to destroy that journal years ago. Then he was correct. Rashid was murdered? We suspected it, Webb admitted, but we could never prove anything. And by then, we were deep in hostile territory, with no way to conduct a proper investigation. We had to bury Rashid and move on. But someone among the expedition was responsible for his death. Someone who has now begun killing the other members one by one. Poirot fixed them with his penetrating gaze. Which of your companions do you suspect? Morrison laughed bitterly. Take your pick, Monsieur Poirot. Harold Pemberton was a ruthless businessman who would do anything to protect his interests. Lady Ashford was cold-blooded enough to order a man's death without losing a moment's sleep. Even Marcus here, he gestured toward Webb. He was desperate to make his reputation with a major discovery. Who knows what he might have done to protect his share of the glory? And you, Captain Morrison, what might you have done? Morrison met his eyes steadily. I was a soldier, Monsieur Poirot. I've killed men in battle. It's what I was trained to do. But I've never murdered an innocent man. And I've never killed outside the rules of warfare. Rashid was a good guide and a decent human being. I had no reason to want him dead. Yet someone did, and that someone is still alive, still killing, still protecting whatever secret was worth murdering for 30 years ago. Not all of us are still alive, Webb said quietly. Pemberton, Lady Ashford, Geoffrey, they're all dead now. That leaves only Colonel Donahue, Captain Morrison, myself, and he trailed off. And the seventh member of the expedition, the one who has not been accounted for. Poirot leaned forward. Where is Rashid Khan's family? Did he leave anyone behind who might have reason to seek revenge? The silence that followed was deafening. Rashid had a son, Morrison said finally. A boy of perhaps 10 or 12 when we hired him. The boy travelled with us for part of the journey, helping with the animals and the camp. What became of him? We don't know. After Rashid died, the boy disappeared. We assumed he had run off, perhaps returned to his village. We were too focused on getting the treasure out of the country to spend much time searching for him. But if the boy survived, if he grew to manhood, nursing a grievance against those who had killed his father and stolen what should have been his inheritance, he might eventually decide to seek justice in his own way. The Silk Road Strangler, Webb breathed. You think Rashid's son is the killer? I think it is a possibility that must be investigated. Poirot rose from his chair. But first, I should like to know more about what happened in that cave 30 years ago. What exactly did you find? And what secret was worth killing to protect? Chapter 4. The truth of the treasure. The story that emerged over the next hour was one of greed, betrayal, and murder. A dark tale that had festered for 3 decades before erupting into the present with deadly consequences. Dr. Webb proved to be the more forthcoming of the 2 survivors, perhaps because the burden of secrecy had weighed most heavily on his scholarly conscience. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, but the truth he revealed was damning. The treasure was everything we had hoped for, and more, he began. Gold coins from a dozen empires, jeweled ornaments that would have graced the courts of kings, manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf that contained knowledge lost for centuries. The historical value alone was incalculable. As for the monetary value, he shook his head. We estimated it at several £1,000,000, even then. Today, it would be worth many times that. And you divided it among yourselves? 7 equal shares? That was the original agreement, yes. But things became complicated. Complicated how? Webb glanced at Morrison, who nodded grimly. Tell him. He'll find out eventually, and it's better he hears it from us. Rashid Khan was not merely our guide, Webb continued. He was also the keeper of certain knowledge, oral traditions passed down through his family for generations. According to these traditions, the treasure we sought had originally belonged to his ancestors. They had been servants of Tamerlane, entrusted with hiding the treasure, and they had been murdered by the conqueror's agents to ensure their silence. Rashid believed that the treasure was his by right of inheritance. He wanted a larger share. He wanted all of it, or at least a controlling interest. He argued, with some justification, I admit, that without his family's knowledge, we never would have found the cave. He demanded half the treasure for himself, with the remaining half to be divided among the rest of us. And the others refused? Pemberton refused. He had financed the expedition. He believed he was entitled to the largest share. Lady Ashford supported him. She had her own claims based on documents her late husband had obtained. The argument became heated. Threats were made. And then Rashid was found dead. The next morning, yes, at the bottom of a ravine, as you know. The official verdict was accidental death, but we all knew, or suspected, the truth. Someone murdered him to avoid sharing the treasure. To avoid losing it entirely. With Rashid dead, his claims died with him. There was no one to contest our division of the spoils. Except his son, Poirot said quietly. The boy who disappeared after his father's death. The boy who might have grown into a man with a very long memory and a very strong desire for revenge. Morrison spoke up. We looked for the boy, I swear we did, but the mountains were vast, the terrain was hostile, and we were in danger ourselves. After 3 days of searching, we had to accept that he was either dead or gone beyond our reach. What was the boy's name? Karim Khan. Poirot filed the name away for future investigation. And what happened to the treasure after you returned to England? It was divided, as agreed. Each of us received a share, artifacts, coins, manuscripts. Some pieces were sold through private channels, others were kept as personal collections. Over the years, the treasure dispersed into the broader market. I doubt anyone could trace all of it now. But someone might try. Someone who believed the treasure rightfully belonged to him, or to his father's memory. Karim Khan. Webb's voice was barely a whisper. You truly believe he is the Silk Road Strangler? I believe it is the most logical explanation for the pattern of murders. 3 victims, all members of the same expedition, all killed with a silk cord, a method that suggests both Eastern origins and symbolic significance. The silk cord was a traditional instrument of execution in many Oriental cultures, used by assassins and executioners alike. But if Karim survived, if he has been planning this revenge for 30 years, why now? Why wait so long to strike? That is precisely what I intend to discover. Poirot rose from his chair. In the meantime, I would advise both of you to take extraordinary precautions. The killer has already claimed 3 victims. There is every reason to believe he intends to eliminate all who were responsible for his father's death. You think we're in danger? Morrison asked. I think you have been in danger since the moment you entered that cave 30 years ago. The question is whether we can identify and apprehend the killer before he completes his mission. Chapter 5. The Trail of Silk. The investigation that followed took Poirot deep into the shadowy world of international antiquities trafficking, where artifacts of dubious provenance changed hands for enormous sums, and questions about original ownership were actively discouraged. He began by tracing the movements of the victims in the months before their deaths. Harold Pemberton had been in Constantinople on business, antiquities business, naturally, when he was killed. His hotel room had been searched by the killer, though it was unclear whether anything had been taken. Lady Ashford had travelled to Cairo to meet with a dealer who specialised in Egyptian and Persian artifacts. She had been found dead the morning after the meeting, which suggested that the killer had followed her, or had been waiting for her. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood's movements were more difficult to trace. He had been in London for months, rarely leaving his townhouse except for visits to the Oriental Club. But his correspondence revealed something interesting. In the weeks before his death, he had received letters from an anonymous source claiming to have information about the expedition's discovery. Information that could reveal the truth about what happened in the cave. Someone was baiting the trap, Poirot observed as he reviewed the letters with Inspector Hartley. Drawing Sir Geoffrey out, preparing him for the final confrontation. The killer? Almost certainly. Note the postmarks: Constantinople, Cairo, and finally London. The letters follow the same pattern as the murders. So the killer was communicating with his victims before he struck? He was tormenting them, reminding them of what they had done, giving them time to anticipate their fate before he arrived to deliver it. That's cold-blooded. It is the behaviour of someone who has nursed a grievance for decades, Inspector. Someone who wants his victims to suffer psychologically before they die physically. The next step was to trace the anonymous letters themselves. The paper was ordinary, available at any stationer's shop. The typing was done on a common Remington machine, but one detail caught Poirot's attention. The stamps used on the envelopes were unusual. Limited edition commemorative stamps that had been issued in small quantities and sold primarily to collectors. A collector of stamps, Poirot murmured. Or someone who wishes to appear as one. Either way, it is a thread that can be followed. He spent the next several days visiting philatelic dealers across London, showing them the stamps and asking whether they had sold similar items recently. Most shook their heads. The stamps were rare, and their clientele tended to be elderly gentlemen of sedentary habits, not the sort to engage in international murder. But one dealer, a Mr. Horace Finch, whose shop occupied a cramped space in a Bloomsbury arcade, recognized the stamps immediately. "Oh yes, I remember selling these, about 6 months ago, to a foreign gentleman, middle-aged, dark-haired, spoke English with an accent I couldn't quite place. Said he was building a collection of Eastern postal history. Did he give his name? Called himself Mr. Karimi, paid in cash, as I recall. Purchased several sets of these stamps, along with some others from the Ottoman territories." Karimi. Karim. The connection was too obvious to ignore. Did this Mr. Karimi leave any contact information? An address, perhaps? He mentioned he was staying at a hotel in Kensington. The Imperial, I believe. But that was months ago. He's probably long gone by now. But Poirot was not so certain. If the killer was following a pattern, if he was eliminating the expedition members one by one, then he would not leave London until his work was complete. There were still survivors, Colonel Donahue, Dr. Webb, Captain Morrison, and the killer would not rest until all of them had paid for their crimes. The Imperial Hotel proved to be a modest establishment catering to foreign visitors of limited means. The manager, a nervous man named Griggs, confirmed that a Mr. Karimi had indeed stayed there several months ago. Quiet gentleman, kept to himself. Paid his bill on time and never caused any trouble. Left about 2 months ago. Didn't say where he was going. Did he receive any visitors during his stay? Any correspondence? Not that I noticed. He spent most of his time out. Said he was conducting research at the British Museum. Something about ancient trade routes. Ancient trade routes. The Silk Road. The pieces were falling into place. Poirot's next stop was the British Museum itself, where he requested access to the records of researchers who had used the institution's extensive collections of Eastern manuscripts and artifacts. It took considerable persuasion and a telephone call from Scotland Yard, but eventually he was granted access to the logs. There it was. A. Karimi, researcher, had spent several weeks studying manuscripts related to the Timurid dynasty, the empire founded by Tamerlane himself. His stated interest was the administration of the medieval Silk Road trade routes, but the specific documents he had requested told a different story. He was researching the expedition, Poirot realized. The same documents that led Colonel Donahue and his companions to the treasure 30 years ago. He was retracing their steps, learning everything he could about what they had discovered and what they had done. But why would he need to research it? Hartley asked. If he's Rashid Khan's son, wouldn't he already know? He would know his father's version of events, but he might not know the full details. Where the treasure went after it was divided, how much each member received, what happened to specific artifacts. For a man planning methodical revenge, such information would be invaluable. So he studies the history, tracks down the victims, and then kills them one by one. But to what end? Revenge alone? Perhaps. Or perhaps there is something else. Something more than mere vengeance driving these murders. Chapter 6. The Missing Piece. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Sir Geoffrey Blackwood's papers more thoroughly, Poirot discovered a series of recent letters that had not been included in the initial police inventory. Letters that had been hidden in a concealed drawer in Sir Geoffrey's desk, apparently placed there for safekeeping. The letters were from Harold Pemberton, written in the months before his death in Constantinople. Their content was explosive. "My dear Geoffrey," the first letter read,
I write to you with news that will either delight or disturb you, depending on your perspective. After 30 years, I have finally located the sardonyx crown, the most valuable single item from our discovery, which we all believed had been lost during the division of the treasure. It was not lost.
Geoffrey, it was stolen, and I now know by whom. The sardonyx crown. Poirot had not heard this artifact mentioned before. He continued reading. You will recall that when we catalogued the treasure, there was one item that exceeded all others in value and historical significance. A crown said to have been worn by Tamerlane himself during his coronation, set with sardonyxes of extraordinary size and quality. We agreed that this single piece would be worth more than all the rest of the treasure combined, and that it would be sold through discreet channels and the proceeds divided equally. But the crown vanished before it could be sold. We searched the camp, searched each other's belongings, accused and counter-accused, but it was never found. Eventually, we concluded that it must have been lost during our journey out of the mountains, dropped or stolen by bandits. I no longer believe this was true. The crown was taken by one of our party, hidden away for private profit, and I have evidence, documentary evidence, that identifies the thief. The letter ended there, with a promise of more details to follow, but the subsequent letters never arrived, or if they did, they had been destroyed or hidden elsewhere. Pemberton was killed before he could reveal what he had learned, Poirot deduced. The Silk Road Strangler murdered him not for revenge alone, but to prevent him from exposing the truth about the crown. But wait, Hartley objected. If the killer is Karim Khan, seeking revenge for his father's death, why would he care about the crown? He would want to kill the expedition members, regardless of what they had stolen from each other. Unless... Poirot's grey cells were working furiously now, rearranging the pieces of the puzzle into a new configuration. Unless the killer is not Karim Khan at all, unless the killer is one of the expedition members themselves, someone who stole the crown 30 years ago and has been protecting that secret ever since. One of the survivors? Donahue, Webb, or Morrison? Or someone we have not yet considered. Someone who has been hidden in plain sight, manipulating events from behind the scenes. Poirot returned to the beginning, reviewing everything he had learned with fresh eyes. 3 victims: Pemberton, Lady Ashford, Sir Geoffrey Blackwood. 3 survivors: Colonel Donahue, Dr. Webb, Captain Morrison. And 1 unknown: Karim Khan, the guide's son, who might or might not be alive, might or might not be seeking revenge. But there was another possibility, one that had been hiding in the shadows all along. The 7th member of the expedition, Poirot said suddenly. Rashid Khan himself. We have assumed he was murdered, but what if that assumption is wrong? What if Rashid Khan survived? But they found his body at the bottom of a ravine. They found a body in the mountains of Afghanistan 30 years ago. Without modern forensic techniques, who could say with certainty whose body it was? What if Rashid faked his own death, escaped with the crown, and has been living in hiding ever since? That's a tremendous stretch, Monsieur Poirot. Is it? Consider. Rashid knew the mountains better than anyone. He had local contacts, local resources. He knew that his life was in danger. The expedition members had refused his demands, and someone was clearly prepared to kill him. What better way to escape than to stage his own death, disappear with the most valuable piece of the treasure, and leave his former companions to believe they had eliminated the threat? But then, why return now? Why start killing after 30 years of hiding?
because something has changed. Perhaps his hiding place is no longer safe. Perhaps he needs money. Or perhaps, Poirot's eyes narrowed. Perhaps he learned that his son is still alive, and he has decided to reclaim not only the treasure, but also his family. Karim Khan. Yes, if Rashid survived, if he has been watching from the shadows all these years, he might have discovered that his son also survived, and that Karim has been seeking revenge of his own. Two separate killers, two separate agendas, converging on the same targets. That would explain why the killer seemed to have inside knowledge of the expedition, Hartley admitted. Rashid would know details that no outsider could possibly discover. And it would explain the silk cord. Rashid was a master of desert survival techniques, including various methods of silent killing. The silk cord was not merely symbolic. It was a signature, a way of identifying himself to those who knew the old ways. Chapter 4. Extended. The investigation deepens. The trail that led Poirot from the philatelist's shop in Bloomsbury to the British Museum's archives proved to be more complex than he had initially anticipated. The man who called himself Karimi, almost certainly Rashid Khan, or someone connected to him, had been methodical in his research, leaving behind a paper trail that revealed the depth of his planning and the patience of his vendetta. In the reading room of the British Museum, Poirot requested access to the same documents that Karimi had studied. They painted a fascinating picture of the medieval Silk Road, a vast network of trade routes that had connected China to the Mediterranean, carrying not only silk and spices, but also ideas, religions, and cultural influences that had shaped civilizations across the globe. But it was the specific documents about the Timurid dynasty that proved most illuminating. Karimi had focused particularly on records related to Tamerlane's personal treasury, inventories of conquest, lists of tribute paid by subject kingdoms, and, most significantly, references to caches of wealth hidden along the trade routes for use in emergencies.
He was looking for validation, Poirot realized as he studied the same texts. He already knew where the treasure was, or had been, but he needed to understand its true significance, the historical context, the cultural meaning, the legitimacy of his family's claim to the artifacts. One document caught his attention particularly, a fragmentary account written by a Persian scribe who had accompanied one of Tamerlane's generals on a campaign through the Hindu Kush. The scribe described a great treasury of gold and precious stones being hidden in a cave 3 days' journey from the fortress of Shari Sabs, protected by servants who were sworn to secrecy and who were executed afterward to ensure their silence. But there was a footnote to the account, added centuries later by a scholar who had studied the original manuscript, noting that, according to local tradition, one servant escaped the execution and preserved the knowledge of the treasury's location, passing it down through his family for generations. Rashid Khan's family. The pieces were falling into place. Poirot continued his research, tracing the various members of the expedition through official records, newspaper archives, and the extensive files maintained by the Oriental Club itself. Each of the 7 expedition members had a distinct personality and history that might explain their role in the events of 30 years ago. Harold Pemberton had been a self-made man, a merchant who had built a fortune through shrewd trading and occasional smuggling. His interest in the expedition had been purely commercial. He saw the treasure as an investment, nothing more. His correspondence from the period revealed a man obsessed with profit margins and market values, who viewed the artifacts not as historical treasures, but as commodities to be exploited.
Lady Marguerite Ashford had been a different sort altogether. Widow of a distinguished diplomat, she had cultivated an image as a patron of the arts and a collector of refined tastes. But beneath this cultured exterior lay a calculating mind that had orchestrated numerous questionable acquisitions over the years. Her late husband's diplomatic connections had given her access to artifacts that should never have left their countries of origin, and her wealth had ensured that awkward questions were rarely asked. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood had been the expedition's conscience, if it could be said to have one. His journal entries revealed a man troubled by the moral implications of their enterprise, who had questioned the right of Western explorers to claim treasures that belonged to Eastern civilizations. But his scruples had not prevented him from accepting his share of the spoils, and his subsequent silence about Rashid Khan's death suggested that his principles were more flexible than he liked to believe. Colonel Donahue was the quintessential military man, loyal, disciplined, and fundamentally honest within the parameters of his profession. His role in the expedition had been primarily organizational, ensuring that the party reached its destination safely and returned with its treasures intact. He had not been involved in the negotiations with Rashid Khan, and he claimed not to have known about the guide's murder until years later. Captain Morrison was the expedition's muscle, a soldier of fortune who had served in numerous conflicts across the East and who had few illusions about human nature. His letters from the period were terse and practical, concerned with logistics and security rather than the historical significance of their discovery. He seemed genuinely surprised when Rashid Khan was found dead, and his subsequent behavior suggested that he had no knowledge of who was responsible. Dr. Marcus Webb was the academic of the group, more interested in documenting the treasure than in profiting from it. His detailed notes and sketches provided the most complete record of what the expedition had discovered, and his subsequent publications, carefully edited to conceal the most sensitive details, had established his reputation as a leading authority on Timurid art and culture. And Rashid Khan himself, the guide whose knowledge had made the discovery possible, and whose death had allowed the others to divide the spoils without interference. What had he been like? What had driven him to threaten the expedition, to demand a share that the others refused to grant? The answer, Poirot suspected, lay in the nature of the treasure itself. To the Western members of the expedition, it was merely valuable, gold and jewels that could be converted into wealth. But to Rashid Khan, it represented something more: a family legacy, a cultural heritage, a sacred trust that had been preserved for centuries against the day when it might be needed to restore the glory of a fallen empire. When the Westerners refused to acknowledge his claim, they had done more than deny him money. They had denied his history, his identity, his very right to exist as anything more than a servant to be used and discarded. Was it any wonder that he had sought revenge? Chapter 7. Extended: The Gathering Storm. The preparation for the trap that would catch the Silk Road Strangler required coordination between multiple agencies and careful attention to detail. Poirot worked closely with Inspector Hartley and the Scotland Yard team, but he also reached out to contacts in the intelligence services, men who had experience with Eastern affairs and who understood the cultural dimensions of the case. One such contact was Major Charles Worthington of the Secret Intelligence Service, a man who had spent decades operating in the territories along the Silk Road and who knew more about the region's history and politics than anyone else in London. "Rashid Khan," Worthington said thoughtfully when Poirot explained the case. "The name is familiar. There was a man by that name who worked as an informant for the Afghan resistance during the war, helped several of our operatives escape when things went bad. Always thought he had some kind of vendetta driving him, but he never explained what it was. When did you last encounter him? Must have been 15 years ago, perhaps more. He was living in Peshawar then, keeping a low profile. Said he was waiting for something, an opportunity that hadn't come yet. I assumed he meant political, some chance to strike against the enemies of his people. Never imagined it might be personal. If your man and our killer are the same person, he has been planning this for a very long time.
That would be consistent with what I know of him. Rashid, if it is indeed the same man, was extraordinarily patient. He could wait for months, even years, for the right moment to strike. It was what made him so valuable as an operative.
And so dangerous as an enemy.
Precisely. If you're planning to trap him, you'll need to be very careful. He'll recognize a setup immediately if you're not convincing. He's survived this long by being smarter than everyone who's tried to catch him. Poirot took this advice to heart, refining his plan to ensure that every detail was authentic enough to fool even a man with Rashid Khan's experience. The gallery, the replica crown, the guest list, all had to be perfect, with no element that might trigger suspicion in a mind trained to detect deception. The days leading up to the viewing were tense. The 3 surviving expedition members, Donahue, Webb, and Morrison, lived under constant police protection, knowing that they might be next on the killer's list. Each dealt with the stress in his own way. Donahue retreated into military stoicism, Webb buried himself in academic work, and Morrison became increasingly aggressive, demanding weapons and authority to protect himself. I've survived a dozen campaigns against enemies more dangerous than some old guide with a grudge, Morrison declared. If Rashid Khan comes for me, I'll be ready for him. That is precisely the attitude that could get you killed, Poirot warned. The Silk Road Strangler has already eliminated 3 of your companions, all of them experienced, all of them presumably on their guard. Confidence is no substitute for caution. Then what would you have me do? Hide like a coward while the police fumble about? I would have you trust the plan we have devised. Your role is to be visible at the viewing, to draw the killer's attention and hold it while the trap closes around him. If you attempt heroics, you may disrupt the operation and allow him to escape. Morrison grumbled, but agreed to follow instructions. His military training asserted itself. Whatever his personal feelings, he understood the importance of discipline in a tactical operation. The night of the viewing approached. The replica crown was installed in its case. The guests were briefed on their roles, and the police positioned themselves at strategic points around the gallery. Everything was ready. Now they only had to wait for the Silk Road Strangler to take the bait. Chapter 10. Extended, Aftermath and Reflection. In the weeks following the arrests of Rashid Khan and Dr. Webb, Poirot found himself reflecting deeply on the nature of the case and its implications for the broader questions of justice, revenge, and the consequences of past actions. The expedition of 30 years ago had set in motion a chain of events that had ultimately claimed 5 lives. Rashid Khan's supposed death in the mountains, Harold Pemberton in Constantinople, Lady Ashford in Cairo, Sir Geoffrey Blackwood in London, and now Rashid himself facing the hangman's noose for his crimes. Dr. Webb would likely spend the rest of his life in prison, and the surviving expedition members would carry the burden of their complicity until their own deaths. All of this tragedy stemmed from a single decision: the refusal to acknowledge Rashid Khan's claim to the treasure that his family had guarded for centuries. If the expedition members had agreed to share the spoils fairly, if they had respected the guide's heritage and his rights, none of the subsequent horrors would have occurred. But they had not. Greed had prevailed over justice, and the consequences had unfolded with the inexorable logic of a Greek tragedy. Poirot thought about the nature of the Silk Road itself, that ancient network of paths that had connected civilizations across thousands of miles, carrying not only goods, but also ideas, beliefs, and cultures. The road had been a place of exchange, where East met West, and both were transformed by the encounter. But it had also been a place of exploitation, where powerful empires had extracted wealth from weaker peoples, where merchants had grown rich by trading in human suffering, where the treasures of ancient civilizations had been stripped away and scattered across foreign lands. The expedition's crime was not unique. It was merely one instance of a pattern that had repeated throughout history. Western collectors and archaeologists had been plundering the cultural heritage of Eastern civilizations for centuries, filling their museums and private collections with artifacts that had never belonged to them, telling stories about discovery and preservation that conveniently omitted the theft and deception that had made such acquisitions possible. Rashid Khan had sought to redress this imbalance through violence. He had failed, ultimately, because violence rarely achieves justice. It merely creates new victims and perpetuates the cycle of revenge. But his motivation, Poirot reflected, was not without a certain legitimacy. The treasure had belonged to his family.
It had been taken by force and deception, and the law, designed primarily to protect the interests of the powerful, had offered him no recourse. Did that justify murder? No. Poirot was firm on this point. The taking of human life could never be justified by historical grievance, no matter how legitimate the underlying complaint. But understanding the motivation was essential to preventing future crimes and to reforming the systems that created such grievances in the first place. The case also illustrated the dangers of secrets, of conspiracies of silence that allowed past crimes to fester until they erupted into present violence. The expedition members had chosen to cover up Rashid Khan's death rather than face the consequences of their actions. They had divided the treasure among themselves and sworn to keep the truth hidden. And that decision had haunted them for 3 decades, creating a bond of complicity that ultimately made them all vulnerable to the killer's revenge. Confession, Poirot thought, might have been the wiser course. Not merely for moral reasons, though those were compelling enough, but for practical ones as well. A secret shared is a weakness exploited. A truth acknowledged is a burden lifted. The expedition members might have faced legal consequences for their actions, but they would not have spent 30 years looking over their shoulders, waiting for the past to catch up with them. These reflections occupied Poirot's thoughts as he closed the file on the Silk Road Strangler case and turned his attention to new mysteries. The world was full of puzzles, full of crimes that demanded his attention and his unique abilities. But he knew he would never entirely forget this case. The twisted paths of revenge and greed, the ghosts that had walked the ancient trade routes, and the terrible price that all the participants had paid for the treasure of Tamerlane. The Silk Road had claimed its final victims, but its secrets, like all secrets, would continue to echo through history, reminding those who cared to listen that the past
is never truly past, and that debts incurred in one generation may be collected in another. Chapter 5. Extended. The evidence accumulates. The evidence that Poirot gathered during his investigation formed a damning picture of both the original expedition and its aftermath. Beyond the journal entries and correspondence already discovered, he uncovered a network of financial transactions that revealed the true scale of the treasure and the methods by which it had been dispersed. The antiquities market, he learned, was a murky world, where provenance was often invented or obscured, where dealers asked few questions if the price was right, and where stolen artifacts could circulate for decades before anyone thought to question their origins. The expedition members had exploited this system ruthlessly, selling pieces of the treasure through multiple channels to avoid attracting attention. Harold Pemberton had been particularly active, using his established trading network to move the most valuable items through dealers in Paris, Vienna, and New York. His records, obtained through a combination of legal process and discreet persuasion, showed sales totaling hundreds of thousands of pounds over the 30 years since the expedition. Lady Ashford had been more selective, focusing on the most exquisite pieces and selling them to wealthy collectors who valued exclusivity above all else. Her clientele included some of the most distinguished names in European society, people who would be deeply embarrassed if their connection to stolen treasure were ever revealed. The academic pieces, manuscripts, ceramics, items of historical rather than monetary value, had largely gone to Dr. Webb, who had used them to build his scholarly reputation while carefully concealing their true origins. His publications had brought the artifacts to the attention of scholars worldwide, but always with invented provenance that obscured their connection to the expedition. Sir Geoffrey Blackwood had taken the most modest share, primarily keeping items of sentimental rather than commercial value. His journal suggested that he had been uncomfortable with the arrangement from the beginning, and he had sold nothing, keeping his pieces as a constant reminder of the moral compromise he had made. Colonel Donahue and Captain Morrison had converted their shares to cash almost immediately, investing the proceeds in legitimate enterprises and leaving no trail that could connect them to the original theft. Of all the expedition members, they had been the most successful at distancing themselves from their crime, and the most surprised when it caught up with them. This pattern of exploitation had continued for decades, with the treasure gradually dispersing into collections and markets around the world. By the time Rashid Khan emerged to seek his revenge, much of the treasure was beyond recovery, scattered across continents, its origins disguised by layers of false documentation. But the sardonyx crown, the single most valuable piece, had remained hidden. Poirot initially believed that Rashid Khan had taken it when he faked his death, but Webb's confession revealed a different truth. Lady Ashford had stolen the crown and had been gradually dismantling it for profit. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. If Lady Ashford had been the crown's thief, then her murder by Webb was not merely a crime of passion, but also a dispute over stolen property. Webb had killed her not just to silence her threats, but perhaps also to gain access to whatever remained of the crown. "You knew about the crown," Poirot confronted him during a subsequent interview. "You knew Lady Ashford had it, and you wanted your share." Webb's face crumpled. "I wanted justice. The crown was supposed to be divided among all of us. That was the agreement." When Marguerite admitted she had been stealing from us for 30 years, selling what rightfully belonged to all of us, I lost control. "And after you killed her?" Did you search for the crown?
I tried, but I didn't know where she had hidden it, and I didn't dare stay in the room too long. The hotel staff might have discovered me at any moment. He laughed bitterly. In the end, I killed her for nothing. The crown was in her country house all along, disguised as a theatrical prop. If I had known that, if I had thought to look there,
You might have found it. But would that have changed anything? Would you still have felt compelled to silence her threats?
Webb had no answer to that question, and perhaps there was no answer to be had. The intersection of greed, fear, and desperation had led to murder, and no amount of rationalization could undo the consequences. Chapter 7. The Gathering. The next phase of Poirot's investigation required him to bring the surviving expedition members together, not merely for questioning, but to observe their reactions to each other and to the revelations he intended to share. If the killer was among them, their behavior might reveal what their words concealed. He arranged the meeting at the Oriental Club, in the same private study where Colonel Donahue had first briefed him on the case. The three survivors arrived separately, each displaying varying degrees of anxiety and suspicion. Colonel Donahue was the picture of military composure, but there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and his hand trembled slightly as he poured himself a brandy from the sideboard. Dr. Webb seemed to have aged years in the few days since their last meeting. His scholarly stoop had become more pronounced, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone expecting an attack at any moment. Captain Morrison, by contrast, appeared almost energized by the danger. His eyes were bright, his movements alert, and he positioned himself near the door with the instinctive caution of a man who had survived many ambushes.
Thank you all for coming, Poirot began. I have asked you here because I have made significant progress in the investigation. Progress that I believe will lead us to the identity of the Silk Road Strangler.
You know who the killer is? Morrison demanded.
I have formed a theory, but before I share it, I must ask each of you some questions. And I must request that you answer with complete honesty. 3 of your companions are dead. If my theory is correct, the killer intends to eliminate all who were involved in the events of 30 years ago. Your lives may depend on your willingness to tell the truth.
Ask your questions, Donahue said heavily. I've spent 30 years carrying this burden. Perhaps it's time to set it down.
Then let us begin with the night of Rashid Khan's death. You all claimed that his fall was an accident, that he stumbled in the darkness and fell into the ravine. But Sir Geoffrey's journal suggests that he was strangled before he fell. Which of you knows the truth?
The 3 men exchanged glances, guilty, frightened, calculating. We all knew, Webb admitted finally. We saw the marks on his throat. We knew someone in our party had killed him.
And yet you said nothing. You covered up the murder and divided the treasure among yourselves.
What choice did we have? Morrison's voice was defensive. We were in the middle of hostile territory, with no law, no authority to appeal to. Even if we had identified the killer, what could we have done? Execute them ourselves? Turn them over to the local tribes, who would have killed us all for the treasure we carried?
So you chose silence. But surely, in 30 years, you must have formed opinions about who was responsible.
Another exchange of glances. We all had our suspicions, Donahue said. Pemberton and Lady Ashford were the most ruthless among us. They had the most to gain from eliminating Rashid's claim. Morrison here had the skills to kill silently, if he chose to use them. And Marcus, he glanced at Webb. Marcus had access to sedatives that could have made the killing easier. You all suspected each other, and yet you maintained the conspiracy of silence. Because any of us could have done it, Webb said bitterly. And all of us were guilty, in a way. We all stood to benefit from Rashid's death. We all chose to take the treasure and keep quiet. Whether one of us actually committed the murder, or whether it truly was an accident that we misinterpreted, we all shared the moral responsibility. An interesting perspective. Poirot paced slowly before the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. But I do not believe Rashid Khan's death was accidental, and I do not believe it was committed by any of you. What? Morrison's voice was sharp. Then who? I believe Rashid Khan killed himself, or rather, that he arranged the appearance of his own death in order to escape with the most valuable piece of the treasure. The Sardonyx crown, Donahue breathed. You know about that? I know that it vanished from the treasure before the division. I know that Harold Pemberton spent years trying to locate it, and I know that he was killed shortly after claiming to have discovered who had taken it. Pemberton thought one of us had stolen the crown, Webb said. He accused each of us in turn, demanded to search our belongings, threatened to expose us to the authorities. But he never found it, because none of you had taken it. Rashid Khan took it, and then faked his own death to escape with his prize. That's impossible, Morrison objected. We saw the body. We buried him ourselves. You buried a body wearing Rashid's clothing, in a condition that made identification difficult. In the chaos that followed his death, did any of you examine the corpse closely enough to confirm its identity? The silence was answer enough. Rashid was a resourceful man, with knowledge of the local terrain and the local people. It would not have been difficult for him to arrange a substitute. A beggar, perhaps, or someone who had died of natural causes. He strangled the substitute to create the appearance of murder, dressed the body in his own clothes, and threw it into the ravine. Then he disappeared into the mountains with the crown, leaving you all to believe he was dead. But if Rashid survived, Donahue said slowly, then he might be the Silk Road Strangler. Yes, Rashid Khan has returned after 30 years to take revenge on those who betrayed him, and perhaps to reclaim additional pieces of the treasure that he believes are rightfully his. But why now? Why wait so long? That I do not yet know, but I intend to find out. Chapter 8. The Trap. The plan that Poirot devised was dangerous but necessary. If Rashid Khan was indeed the killer, then he would not stop until all the expedition members were dead. The only way to catch him was to present him with an irresistible target, a trap baited with the one thing he wanted most. The Sardonyx crown, Poirot explained to the assembled survivors. We must make the killer believe that the crown has been located, that it is about to change hands in a way that will put it beyond his reach forever. But the crown has been missing for 30 years, Webb protested. We don't even know if it still exists. The killer does not know that. We will spread rumors through the antiquities network that the crown has surfaced, that it is being offered for private sale by an anonymous collector. We will arrange a viewing at a secure location, invite potential buyers, and create the appearance of a legitimate transaction. And when the killer comes for the crown, We'll be waiting for him, Morrison finished. It's a classic military operation.
establish a position, draw out the enemy, and strike when they expose themselves. Precisely. But the trap must be convincing. The viewing must appear genuine. The security must be visible but not overwhelming. And at least one of you must be present to serve as bait. "You're asking us to risk our lives," Donahue observed. "I am asking you to help catch the man who has already killed 3 of your companions, and who will certainly kill again if he is not stopped. The risk is real, but it is less than the risk of doing nothing and waiting for the killer to strike again." After considerable debate, the survivors agreed to the plan. The viewing would be held at a private gallery in Mayfair, owned by a dealer who owed favours to both the antiquities community and Scotland Yard. The crown would be a convincing replica created by a theatrical prop maker who specialised in historical pieces. And the guests would include not only potential buyers, but also plainclothes police officers prepared to apprehend anyone who attempted to steal the artefact. The night of the viewing arrived cold and clear, with a frost that turned the London streets into glittering ribbons of ice. Poirot positioned himself in a back room of the gallery, where he could observe the proceedings through a concealed opening, while remaining hidden from the guests. The viewing attracted a substantial crowd: wealthy collectors, museum representatives, dealers who specialized in medieval antiquities. They circulated through the gallery, examining the replica crown with appropriate reverence, murmuring appreciation for its craftsmanship and historical significance. Colonel Donahue, Dr. Webb, and Captain Morrison were all present, moving among the guests with varying degrees of ease. Donahue played the role of genial host, welcoming visitors and sharing anecdotes about the crown's supposed history. Webb provided scholarly commentary, describing the techniques used in its creation and its significance within the Timurid artistic tradition. Morrison stood near the crown itself, ostensibly as additional security, his eyes constantly scanning the room for threats. For the first hour, nothing unusual occurred. The guests viewed the crown, asked questions, expressed interest or skepticism according to their natures. One dealer made a preliminary offer. Another requested a private viewing to examine the piece more closely. And then, shortly after 10 o'clock, a new guest arrived. He was middle-aged, with dark hair streaked with grey, and a weathered face that spoke of years spent in harsh climates. He wore evening dress that fit well, but not perfectly, as though purchased for the occasion rather than tailored to his frame. And his eyes, dark, intense, filled with something that might have been hatred or might have been hunger, swept the room with the deliberate assessment of a predator. Poirot's grey cells sparked with recognition. This was no ordinary guest. This was someone who had come with a specific purpose, a purpose that had nothing to do with legitimate acquisition. The stranger moved through the crowd with practiced ease, pausing occasionally to examine a piece or exchange pleasantries with another guest. But his true attention was focused elsewhere, on the 3 survivors who had noticed his arrival and were watching him with barely concealed alarm. When he reached the display case containing the crown, he stood for a long moment, studying the replica with an expression that was impossible to read. Then, very softly, he spoke. "It is beautiful, is it not? But not quite right. The craftsmanship is excellent, but the stones are wrong. The real crown had sardonyxes of a particular shade, orange and white, with veins of crimson running through them like blood. These are merely carnelians, pretty enough, but lacking the fire of the originals. Colonel Donahue had approached during this observation. "You speak as though you have seen the original crown." "I have." The stranger turned to face him, and there was no longer any pretense of casual interest. "I have seen it many times. I have held it in my hands. I have worn it on my head, as my ancestors did before me."
"Your ancestors?"
"My family served the great Tamerlane. We guarded his treasures for 500 years, and we were betrayed by men like you. Men who came with smiles and promises, who took what did not belong to them, and who murdered those who stood in their way."
"Rashid." Donahue's voice was barely a whisper. "Rashid Khan. You're alive."
"I am alive, and I have come to collect what is owed to me."
Chapter 9. The Confrontation. The gallery fell silent as the other guests became aware that something unusual was happening. Several began moving toward the exits. Others pressed closer, curious about the confrontation unfolding before them. Poirot stepped out of his concealment, flanked by Inspector Hartley and 2 constables. "Rashid Khan, I presume. You are under arrest for the murders of Harold Pemberton, Lady Marguerite Ashford, and Sir Geoffrey Blackwood." The man who called himself Rashid Khan did not seem surprised by the appearance of the police. If anything, his expression suggested a certain grim satisfaction. "Hercule Poirot, I wondered when you would show yourself. The famous detective, solver of impossible crimes. But this crime is not so impossible, is it? It is quite simple, really. Justice, delayed for 30 years, finally delivered." "Murder is not justice, monsieur. Whatever wrongs were done to you, they do not justify taking human lives." "Do they not?" Rashid's eyes blazed with sudden fury. "These men, and the woman who died with them, stole everything I had. My treasure, my heritage, my family. They left me to die in the mountains, thinking they had eliminated the only witness to their crime. But I survived. I survived, and I remembered. And I swore that one day they would pay for what they had done."
"You faked your own death. You escaped with the crown and disappeared." "I did what I had to do to survive. They would have killed me, truly killed me, if I had not acted first. So, I found a body, a beggar who had died of cold in the mountain passes, and I dressed him in my clothes and threw him into the ravine. Then I took the crown and fled." "And you have been hiding ever since, for 30 years?" "Not hiding, waiting, building resources, gathering information, preparing for the day when I could finally take my revenge." Rashid's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Do you know what it is like, Monsieur Poirot, to watch from the shadows as the people who destroyed your life grow rich and comfortable and respected? To see them enjoying the fruits of their theft while you scrape by on whatever crumbs you can gather? For 30 years, I watched them. I knew where they lived, what they owned, who they loved. And I knew that one day I would make them suffer as they had made me suffer." "And so you became the Silk Road Strangler. You hunted them down, one by one, and killed them with a silk cord, the traditional weapon of your people." The cord was more than a weapon. It was a message. Each of them knew, in the moment before they died, exactly who had come for them and why. They knew that their past had finally caught up with them, that the sins of the Silk Road could not remain buried forever. And what of the crown? What became of it? For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across Rashid's face. The crown is safe, hidden where none of you will ever find it. Is it? Or did you lose it long ago? Gambled away, or sold to fund your decades of hiding, or stolen by someone you trusted? Rashid's composure cracked. You know nothing of what I have endured,
Nothing of the sacrifices I have made. The crown is mine. It has always been mine, and I will see it returned to its rightful place if it takes another 30 years. I fear you will not have 30 years, monsieur. You will spend whatever remains of your life in a prison cell, paying for the murders you have committed. The constables moved forward to take Rashid into custody, but he was faster than they expected. In one fluid motion, he produced a silk cord from his sleeve and lunged toward Colonel Donahue, clearly intending to add one more victim to his toll before he was captured. But Captain Morrison was faster still. His military training took over, and he intercepted Rashid with a tackle that sent both men crashing to the floor. The cord went flying, and before Rashid could recover, he found himself pinned beneath Morrison's considerable weight, with a constable's knee on his back and handcuffs clicking around his wrists. "It's over," Morrison said, breathing heavily. 30 years of hiding, 30 years of planning, and it ends like this, on the floor of a Mayfair gallery surrounded by fake antiquities. Rashid laughed, a bitter, broken sound. It is never over. The sins of the Silk Road have a way of finding those who commit them. You may have caught me, but you will never be free of what you did. You will carry the memory of your betrayal to your graves. Perhaps, Morrison hauled him to his feet, but at least we will have graves, which is more than you gave to Geoffrey or Pemberton or Lady Ashford. Chapter 10. The Truth Revealed. The arrest of Rashid Khan brought the immediate threat to an end, but Poirot's investigation was not yet complete. There remained questions that demanded answers, questions about the crown, about the original murder in the mountains, and about the true nature of the conspiracy that had bound these people together for 3 decades. He conducted a final series of interviews over the following days, speaking with each of the survivors individually, pressing for details that had been omitted or obscured during earlier conversations. Gradually, the full picture emerged, a picture far more complex and troubling than the simple narrative of theft and revenge. Colonel Donahue proved to be the most forthcoming, perhaps because the arrest of Rashid Khan had lifted a burden he had carried for far too long. "I knew," he admitted. "I knew from the beginning that Rashid had been murdered, not by accident, not by an unknown assailant, but by one of our own party." "Who?" "Lady Ashford." Donahue's voice was heavy with old guilt. "I saw her leave the camp that night, shortly before Rashid was found. She was carrying something, a cord or rope, and when she returned, her hands were shaking. I confronted her later, demanded to know what she had done. She told me that Rashid had threatened to expose us all, to bring the local authorities down on us, and claim the entire treasure for himself. She said she had no choice, that it was him or all of us." "And you believed her?" "I believed she had killed him. Whether she was justified," he shook his head. "At the time, I convinced myself that she was. We were in danger, the treasure was at stake, and Rashid had made threats. But now, after 30 years, after watching his victims die one by one, I wonder if we were the villains all along. Lady Ashford killed Rashid Khan. But then, who killed Lady Ashford? Rashid himself, obviously. He survived, he waited, and he took his revenge. That is what we are meant to believe. But consider, Rashid claims to have killed all 3 victims,
Pemberton, Lady Ashford, and Sir Geoffrey. He confesses freely to these murders, takes pride in them even. But there are inconsistencies in his account that trouble me. What kind of inconsistencies? The timing, primarily. Rashid speaks of tracking his victims, studying their movements, waiting for the perfect moment to strike.
But the murder of Lady Ashford was rushed, improvised. She was killed in her hotel room within hours of arriving in Cairo, before she could have been properly surveilled. And there is the matter of the letters.
The threatening letters that the victims received?
Yes, Rashid admits to sending letters to Pemberton and Sir Geoffrey, warning them that their past would catch up with them. But he denies sending any letter to Lady Ashford, says he wanted her death to come as a surprise, unheralded by any warning.
Then who sent the letter to Lady Ashford?
That is the question that has been troubling my grey cells since I began this investigation. Poirot paused, choosing his words with care. I believe that Rashid Khan is guilty of murder, but not necessarily of all the murders attributed to him. I believe there is another killer, someone who has been using Rashid's crimes to conceal their own.
Another killer? But who?
Someone with access to the same information Rashid possessed. Someone who knew about the expedition, the treasure, the death in the mountains. Someone who had reason to want Lady Ashford dead, and perhaps others as well. Donohue's face went pale.
You're not suggesting...
I am suggesting that the truth of this case is more complicated than a simple tale of revenge. I am suggesting that we have been looking at these events from the wrong angle, seeing a pattern that was deliberately constructed to mislead us.
Then what is the truth?
The truth, Colonel, is that Rashid Khan is not the only person who survived that expedition with murder in their heart. And the Sardonic's crown, the treasure that everyone has been seeking for 30 years, may hold the key to understanding who the other killer is. Chapter 11. The Second Killer. The revelation that there might be a second killer sent shockwaves through the surviving expedition members. If Rashid Khan was not responsible for all the murders, then the threat had not ended with his arrest. Someone else was out there. Someone who had used Rashid's vendetta as cover for their own crimes. Poirot focused his attention on the murder of Lady Ashford, the one that did not quite fit the pattern established by the others. He obtained detailed records from the Egyptian authorities, police reports, witness statements, the findings of the medical examiner, and studied them with meticulous care. The facts were these. Lady Ashford had arrived in Cairo on the evening of September 15th. She had checked into Shepherd's Hotel around 8 o'clock, dined alone in her room, and retired early, complaining of fatigue from her journey. The next morning, when she failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with an antiquities dealer, the hotel staff entered her room and found her dead, strangled with a silk cord, precisely like the other victims. But there were anomalies. The silk cord used to kill Lady Ashford was of a different quality than those used in the other murders. Cheaper, more readily available, the kind that could be purchased at any marketplace in Cairo. The marks on her throat suggested a killer of lesser physical strength than would be expected from Rashid Khan, who was, by all accounts, a powerful man despite his age. And there was no sign that the killer had searched the room, unlike the Pemberton murder, where the hotel room had been thoroughly ransacked. Lady Ashford was killed by someone other than Rashid Khan, Poirot concluded. Someone who knew about the Silk Road Strangler, who understood his methods, and who used those methods to disguise a murder that had nothing to do with the expedition's history. But who would want Lady Ashford dead? Hartley asked. If not Rashid,
If not revenge for the original crime, then what was the motive? That is what we must discover, and I believe the answer lies in the events of the past few months, not the past 30 years. Poirot began by investigating Lady Ashford's recent activities.
She had been a wealthy woman, a collector of considerable means, whose purchases and sales of antiquities had made her a significant figure in the market. Her correspondence revealed a complex web of transactions, negotiations, and disputes that might have created enemies. One name appeared repeatedly in these documents: Dr. Marcus Webb. Lady Ashford and Dr. Webb were involved in a business arrangement, Poirot discovered. A partnership to locate and sell certain artifacts that had been acquired during the expedition. But the partnership had soured. There were accusations of cheating, threats of legal action, letters that grew increasingly hostile in the months before Lady Ashford's death. You think Webb killed her? I think Webb had motive, opportunity, and the knowledge necessary to commit the crime in a way that would be attributed to Rashid Khan. He was one of the original expedition members. He knew about Rashid's survival, or suspected it at least. And he was in Cairo at the time of Lady Ashford's death, attending an academic conference that provided him with a convenient cover story. But Webb was supposedly attending lectures at the time of the murder. Supposedly, yes, but academic conferences are notoriously chaotic. It would not be difficult to slip away for an hour or two, especially if one had planned the absence in advance. Poirot confronted Webb with his suspicions, meeting him in the library of the Oriental Club on a grey December afternoon. The scholar's face went through several expressions: surprise, denial, fear, before settling into a kind of defeated resignation. "You are remarkably perceptive, Monsieur Poirot. I suppose I should have expected nothing less." "Then you admit it? You killed Lady Ashford." "I killed her." Webb's voice was barely audible. "God help me, I killed her, and I have been living with the guilt of it ever since." "Tell me what happened." The story that emerged was one of greed, desperation, and a moment of violence that had spiraled far beyond Webb's intentions. Marguerite and I had been partners for years, selling pieces from the treasure, laundering the proceeds through legitimate antiquities transactions. It was profitable, and we had established channels that allowed us to move even the most questionable items without attracting attention. But then Marguerite became greedy. She had been keeping records, detailed records, of all our transactions, all the pieces we had sold, all the buyers we had dealt with. She threatened to expose me if I didn't give her a larger share of the profits. She said she would go to the authorities, reveal everything about the expedition, destroy my reputation and my career. "And so you decided to silence her?" "I didn't plan it that way. I swear I didn't. I went to Cairo to negotiate, to find some accommodation that would satisfy her without ruining me. But when I arrived at her hotel room, she laughed at me. She said my share of the treasure was nothing compared to what she had already taken, that she had stolen the sardonyx crown 30 years ago and had been selling pieces of it ever since. Lady Ashford had the crown, not Rashid Khan. That's what she claimed. She said Rashid was a fool, that she had planted the body and staged his death to cover her own theft of the crown. She had been selling the sardonyxes one by one, replacing them with worthless stones, gradually dismantling the greatest treasure of the Timurid dynasty for private profit. And when you learned this, I was furious. All those years, while the rest of us wondered what had happened to the crown, while Pemberton drove himself mad trying to locate it, Marguerite had been sitting on a fortune and playing us all for fools. I confronted her,
demanded my share, and she laughed again, said I could prove nothing, that she would destroy me if I tried to expose her. So you killed her? I grabbed her throat. I didn't mean to. It was a reflex, a moment of rage. But she was so small, so fragile. By the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. She was dead. And the silk cord? I had heard the rumors about the Silk Road Strangler. Everyone in our circle had. I thought if I made it look like one of his killings, no one would suspect me. I found a silk cord in Marguerite's room. She used it to tie her parcels, and I wrapped it around her neck to create the appearance of strangulation. But Rashid Khan had not yet killed anyone when Lady Ashford died. The Constantinople murder was 3 months earlier, but there was no established pattern, no Silk Road Strangler for you to imitate. Webb's face crumpled. I know it doesn't make sense when I explain it, but at the time, in that moment of panic, I thought if there was another murder with a silk cord, people would assume it was the same killer. I thought I could hide in the shadow of someone else's crime. And then Rashid Khan actually began his campaign of revenge, killing Sir Geoffrey and the others. You must have felt extraordinarily fortunate. Fortunate? Webb laughed bitterly. I have been in hell, Monsieur Poirot. Every time I heard of another murder, I felt like I was being dragged deeper into a nightmare I could not escape. The Silk Road Strangler was covering my crime, yes, but he was also a constant reminder of what I had done. And now the truth has emerged. You will face justice for the murder of Lady Ashford, and for the cover-up that allowed Rashid Khan's crimes to go undetected for so long. I know. Webb seemed almost relieved. I've been waiting for someone to discover the truth. Carrying this secret has been worse than any punishment the law could impose. Chapter 12. The Denouement. The arrest of Dr. Marcus Webb brought the case to its conclusion, though the full story would take months to unravel. 2 killers, 2 separate sets of crimes, intertwined in a pattern of deception that had allowed both to operate in the shadows for far longer than should have been possible. Rashid Khan was tried for the murders of Harold Pemberton and Sir Geoffrey Blackwood, crimes he freely admitted and seemed almost proud of. His defense argued that he had been driven to extremity by the original theft of his family's treasure and the murder of his reputation. But the jury was not swayed. He was convicted on both counts and sentenced to death, though he received the verdict with the same grim satisfaction he had displayed throughout the trial. Dr. Marcus Webb was tried separately for the murder of Lady Marguerite Ashford. His defense was more complex, claiming temporary insanity brought on by extreme provocation. But the evidence of planning and cover-up undermined this argument. He was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison, a verdict that seemed to provide him with a certain grim relief. The surviving expedition members, Colonel Donahue and Captain Morrison, were never charged with any crime, though their complicity in the original cover-up of Rashid Khan's death cast a permanent shadow over their reputations. Both resigned from the Oriental Club and withdrew from public life, living out their remaining years in quiet obscurity. As for the Sardonic's crown, the truth proved to be even stranger than Poirot had imagined. Following Webb's confession about Lady Ashford's revelations, investigators searched her properties and discovered the remains of the legendary artifact. Not in a secret vault or hidden compartment, but displayed openly in her country house, where it had been passed off as a theatrical replica for decades. Most of the original sardonyxes had indeed been sold off over the years, replaced with worthless stones, but the gold framework remained, a skeleton of the treasure that had cost so many lives.
The crown was eventually returned to the nation of Afghanistan, whose government claimed it as part of their cultural heritage. The other pieces of the expedition's treasure, those that could be traced, followed a similar path, scattered across museums and collections that had unwittingly purchased stolen artifacts. Poirot reflected on the case one evening, seated in his London flat with a cup of his customary tisane. The Silk Road had always been a place of crossings, of cultures, of goods, of ideas. But it had also been a place of secrets, where treasures were lost and found, where lives were traded like commodities, where the past never truly stayed buried. The Silk Road Strangler had sought justice for a crime that had gone unpunished for 30 years. Dr. Webb had killed to protect secrets that were crumbling around him anyway. Lady Ashford had stolen and schemed and manipulated, only to be undone by her own greed. And the expedition members who had thought themselves safe, who had believed their sins would never find them, had learned that the Silk Road's debts were always collected, one way or another.
Such is the nature of justice,
Poirot murmured to himself as he stroked his magnificent moustache with thoughtful contemplation.
It may be delayed by circumstances and by the machinations of those who seek to escape it. It may be disguised by elaborate schemes and false trails, but it cannot be denied forever. The sins of the Silk Road, like all sins committed by mortal men and women, must eventually be paid for. And the accounts are always balanced in the end, whether by the hand of man or by the inexorable workings of fate itself.
He set down his delicate porcelain cup on its saucer and gazed out the rain-streaked window at the London evening, watching the gas lamps flicker in the gathering fog. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new puzzles, new opportunities to exercise his formidable grey cells in service of justice and truth. But the memory of this particular case, with its twisted paths of revenge and greed, winding across continents like the ancient trade routes themselves, the secrets that had festered in darkness for 3 long decades before erupting into violence and death, would stay with him for a very long time indeed. The Silk Road Strangler had been caught and would face the ultimate penalty for his crimes. Justice had been served, as it must always be served when Hercule Poirot applies his unique talents to a case. But the ghosts of the expedition, the betrayals that had fractured friendships, the murders that had claimed innocent and guilty alike, the cursed treasure that had corrupted everyone whose hands it touched, those ghosts would never truly be laid to rest. They would linger in the shadows of memory, reminding all who remembered this case that the past is never truly past, that debts incurred in youth must be paid in age, and that the sins of one generation have a way of visiting their consequences upon those who follow. Such was the price of seeking treasure in places where treasure was not meant to be found. Thank you for joining us on The Little Grey Cells for Secrets of the Silk Road Strangler. If this tale of ancient treasure, long-buried secrets and deadly revenge across continents captured your imagination, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you suspect there were 2 killers operating independently before the reveal? Or did the complexity of the conspiracy take you by surprise? What did you think of Rashid Khan's 30-year quest for vengeance against those who had wronged him and stolen his family's heritage? Was he a monster, driven by pure hatred? Or merely a man who had been driven to extremity by the betrayals and crimes committed against him? And what about Dr. Marcus Webb, whose moment of uncontrolled rage cost Lady Ashford her life, and whose subsequent cover-up
entangled him in the web of the Silk Road Strangler's crimes? Did he deserve sympathy for his circumstances, or condemnation for his actions? The questions raised by this case have no easy answers, but they are worth contemplating nonetheless, for they touch upon deep matters of justice, revenge, cultural heritage, and the consequences of past crimes. We love hearing from fellow mystery enthusiasts, and your engagement helps us bring more tales of the little Belgian detective to life. The world of Hercule Poirot is vast and endlessly fascinating, filled with puzzles that challenge the mind and moral dilemmas that trouble the conscience. Until next time, keep those grey cells active and well exercised. Remember that the longest roads eventually lead back to where they began, and trust that justice, like the caravans of old that traversed the Silk Road, bearing precious goods across impossible distances, always reaches its destination in the end, however long the journey may take. The Silk Road may have faded into the mists of history, but the lessons it teaches about greed, betrayal, and the long arm of justice remain as relevant as ever. And Poirot's methods of observation and deduction remain as sharp as the finest Damascus blade. Farewell, dear listeners and fellow seekers of truth, and may your own investigations lead you to wisdom, justice, and understanding of the human heart.